Hi, I'm Chuck Olenek. I'm a Ukrainian-American who was baptized with the name Yaroslav, and oddly enough, that's the name I chose to use in the medieval reenactment organization, the Society for Creative Anachronism. My dad made me a history geek. He would not let me forget that I was part of a link in a chain, and told me that not everyone's history gets written and that it was up for me to find it. Well, I ended up stumbling into teaching history, became that major history geek, and I was always researching part of my heritage. And part of that included the mythology and the folklore of my ancestors. So, of course, I had to dive whole hog into it, and I'm going to try to turn this research into a series of videos on the Slavic mythology and folklore. And where we got to start out, I ended up starting out in a different place than I planned. I thought I was going to be getting into uh, Karun and, the god of thunder, and Mokosh and, Dajbog and those guys. And my first video in this series, Tales of from the Borderland, that ended up dealing with Chernobog and Bielobog, the dark god and the god of light, who turned out to be created later, but everyone knows about Chernobog from Disney and American Gods. Well, then I thought this would be the chapter that I'll be getting into all those guys up on the hill. No, it's not working out that way at all. When Prince Volodymyr of Kiev decided to become a Christian because he wanted to marry the sister of the Emperor of Constantinople, and she wasn't having anything to do with marrying a pagan, he had kind of a problem. One of the problems was he had this temple up on Starokivska hill in Kiev, and it was a temple dedicated to 6 gods. And of course, he ends up getting baptized, and he forces all of his people into the Dnipro River, and they get baptized. And then he has the idols all torn down, and they're beaten with rods to show that, hey, look, we don't do this anymore, and throw the idols in the Dnipro River. But I actually got to go to an intermediate step as far as the mythos. And this is going to give me a chance to explore Kiev's version of the early Greek mythology, where there's the war between the Titans and the Olympians. So I hope you stick around and watch this. So the first Slavic god we're going to be taking a look at is Rod. And he's kind of like the Slavic version of, well, he's like a cross between Chaos, who ends up creating Gaia and Uranus. And yes, I pronounced that correctly, and I even managed to say it without a smile. And also kind of crossed with Uranus, because Gaia and Uranus give birth to the Titans, Kronos and that whole group. And then we're going to have the Olympians after that. Well, Rod's that combination of that. He's that primordial god. So this gets to sound very biblical here, but in the beginning, before time existed, there was Rod, and there was nothing around him. And according to some believers, Rod created the universe and the 3 worlds, Hav, Prav, and Nav, and he arranged everything inside them. And he also created the principle of balance between elements, and he enforced this higher law of pravda, and that basically meant everything that existed, every creature, every power, whether it was physical or metaphysical, whether it was material or energy, had to obey this law of pravda. Okay, unlike Chernobyl and Bielobog, Rod's name was confirmed in Old Church Slavonic and in Old East Slavonic sources that were pre Christian. They said that he was worshipped. And the name comes from a Proto Slavic word called roda and rod. And it's got connections to family and birth and origin and clan. And so you're kind of getting into an ancestor worship thing, but it's also connected to another word, arada, which has to do with guardians or keepers. And also there's a connection to yield and harvest. So Rod kind of is a fertility god. So where do children come from? Well, Rod has been sitting around in a chair and he's casting mounds upon the earth, and their children are born. There's other gods. He made them too. All right. And he gave each god or goddess his or her, okay, pronouns get confusing, their own characteristics, their own attributes, and basically their own jobs, as far as what they were in charge of. And it's actually pretty likely that the names of a lot of gods, like Svarog, they were probably incarnations of Rod, but that's gonna end up changing. Okay, Rod is connected to the Rozhanitsy, and this is like mother daughter goddesses of fertility. Hey, there's that fertility stuff again. And their feast day happens to be on the autumnal equinox, and that marks the completion of the harvest traditionally. The Rozhanitsy, they would watch over the birth of children and animals. They would ensure the fertility of the land, and they controlled individual destiny. All right, in their honor, meatless feasts were prepared, and offerings were made of bread, porridge, curd, and mead. Okay, their following was essentially like a private thing, sort of like you did that in the house. And they were the guardians of life-giving waters, and you'll be hearing more about the life-giving waters later. They were the protectors of warriors, a lot like the Rusalka. Now, not a lot is known about how Rod was worshipped, but I do know that one's first haircut, a child's first haircut, Postrizhiny, that was dedicated to him, and there would be a celebration uh, where a feast was laid out for the Rod and the Rozhanitsy, and the hair from that first haircut were included. During the season of Koliada, which basically took place between the winter solstice and January 6th, which suspiciously sounds like the Christmas season. Rod was honored during the first half of that, or the December part, and that was also to honor the sun. Hey, it's getting lighter. All right, so the sun's coming back. And during the January part, Veles was honored, and we'll be talking about Veles when we get to talking about Perun, so I figure that'll probably be in the next segment. So Rod may have been the first god, but his worship is eventually going to be cast aside in favor of others. And, it's kind of like the Greek mythology thing of the Olympians, led by Zeus, have this series of battles and wars for 10 years with the Titans that are led by Kronos, and eventually victory goes to the Olympians and Zeus is in charge. Well, with the Slavic folklore or mythology, it isn't that violent. It's just eventually Rod, who created all the other gods and goddesses, he just kind of gets shoved aside. And in the 9th or 10th century, his worship is, or his place, is taken over by Svarog and eventually Perun by the aristocracy, especially the military folks. And that's why there was no statue on the hill where the idols were in Volodymyr's time. But think of Rod as kind of the old faith. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Svarog before we get to Perun and the other gods and goddesses. Rod created Svarog, the divine smith, and he is to have done this by creating him from the heart of a world with burning seas of molten rock. And he molded Svarog together. And Svarog arrived in the world before anything else came into being. And the god was gifted with an anvil by Rod, with which he could make anything. And Rod then began the ultimate sacrifice. He's using his blood as material for a Svarog to shape all the other celestial beings. So he spills his blood upon the anvil, and Svarog goes to work, and he creates all the other gods and goddesses who eventually are going to supplant Rod's worship. And Svarog is not just the divine smith, he's also a fire god and a sun god, and he was also the founder of marriage. And his name means bright and clear. He perfected the art of forging weapons. As a smith god, he was identified with the generative and sexual powers of fire. So that's kind of how he connects to marriage. And fire was considered so sacred that it was forbidden to shout or swear while a fire was being lit. And I know it because my dad still kind of, in some ways, he'd been brought up with the custom of you don't swear, you don't shout loud in the house, you don't whistle by fire because that offends. It was explained as it's offensive, it's wrong. But then when I started researching, I went, ooh, wow, so there's still kind of a connection to the worship of Svarog. Svarog was also the shining hero. He created a whirlwind as he battled the hideous serpent, or maybe it was a multi-headed dragon called Zmi. Svarog, as divine smith, uses his blacksmith's tongs and catches me and harnesses him to a plow. And with that plow, he creates a ditch between Hav, the world of the living, and Nav, the world of the dead, and that creates order, Prav. And Zmi is basically cast into the land of the dead. Now, I already mentioned that Svarog could create a whirlwind. Well, it wasn't just creating a whirlwind. He could change into a whirlwind, or he could change into a falcon, or he could change into a golden horned auroch, or a boar, or a horse. His most famous shrine kind of connects with that. And that was in the area of the Elbe River with the Polabians. And they had a temple that had a gold effigy of the god, and he's wearing a helm that looks like a bird with outstretched wings. Ooh, gets into sort of that Thor vibe there. Okay, folklore gives Svarog two sons, Dojbog, the sun god, and we'll talk about him later, and Svarog, who is the god of fire, most especially the fire that was used to dry out the grain after harvest. And humans were sacrificed to him. However, there's some sources that say that Svarog and Svarog are basically the same one. It's the same god. Because, like Svarog, he's supposed to also wear a helm that looks like a bird with the wings outstretched. But also, he would have a double-edged axe in his left hand and a shield in his right hand, and on his breast he was wearing a black bison's head. So there's similarities here, and that kind of adds to the confusion. All right, now the symbol for Svarog is called a kolovrat or a swastika. It's going to look a lot like a swastika, guys. So with Rod's help, Svarog creates a world, because after all, Rod created Svarog. Rod gave him this anvil that he could make anything on. Rod spilled his blood on the anvil, while Svarog forged the gods and helped forge the world, all that stuff. So it's small wonder that eventually the worship of Svarog is going to push aside the worship of Rod. And the same thing is going to happen where just a little more time passes. The worship of Perun, especially by the aristocracy and the military, that pushes aside Svarog, and Svarog becomes considered to be a little more than a fire spirit in a lot of circles, except by his very small and resilient cult who forbid Svarog's name to even be said. And it was said that in some legends, Svarog's asleep, and his dreams are creating the world of man. And that if and when Svarog awakens, the realm of men will crumble. Okay, so hopefully I'm getting to Perun and Veles, the next two big gods, in the next chapter. I hope you stick with me.